The shriek of sirens shattered the quiet street as flashing red and blue lights bled across manicured lawns. Neighbors peeked through blinds, watching the chaos unfold. At the center stood Karen Whitfield, HOA president and self-proclaimed guardian of community standards, clutching her phone with trembling rage. She had just dialed 911, demanding police evict her neighbor. What she didn't know was that her target wasn't just a homeowner. He was a decorated federal marshal with a badge, a record of hunting criminals across state lines, and nothing left to fear. What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? Pine Ridge Estates looked peaceful from the outside. White fences, trimmed hedges, and cul-de-sacs where children once rode bikes. But beneath the veneer, the HOA had become a weapon, controlled by Karen Whitfield like her personal kingdom. Karen was 50, wealthy from inherited money, and carried herself with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no. Rules weren't guidelines. They were weapons, and she enforced them with merciless precision. Trash cans an inch too close to the curb, $200 fine. A wreath deemed too religious, removal order plus late fees. She'd even threatened elderly neighbors with foreclosure over missed dues of less than $50. But her newest obsession was John Carter, a widower, decorated U.S. Marshal, and quiet man who'd returned home after losing his wife to illness. His brick colonial sat on the corner lot, flag waving in the breeze, yard meticulously cared for. Yet to Karen, his very existence was a violation. First came petty letters about his porch lights, then citations over his late wife's memorial bench in the front garden. But behind her paperwork and pastel stationery lay something darker. Karen's desperate need to crush anyone she couldn't control. And John Carter was about to prove she had chosen the wrong target. Because this wasn't just another homeowner. This was a man who had spent his life dismantling criminal syndicates. A man who'd buried his wife, but not his sense of justice. Karen had declared war on someone with the power and the will to fight back. And her next move would ignite a storm. John Carter was not the kind of neighbor who made waves. He cut his lawn, waved politely, and kept mostly to himself. But loss had carved deep lines into his face, and silence had become his closest companion since burying Emily, the woman he'd loved for 27 years. What Karen never noticed was the small plaque inside his home. It wasn't decorative. It was an award for valor, earned after dismantling a cartel that had left half his task force dead. John had stared down murderers, traffickers, and fugitives most people wouldn't dare speak to. He had a badge, a weapon, and the iron patience of a man who understood how criminals destroyed themselves when cornered. Karen, blinded by her own power, mistook his silence for weakness. To her, John was just another widower. An easy mark, someone she could intimidate with threats and citations. But every letter she sent, every violation she fabricated, every attempt to humiliate him in front of neighbors, all of it was being documented. Not by a desperate homeowner, but by a lawman trained to build airtight federal cases. And when she crossed the line from harassment into crime, John wouldn't just defend his home. He would dismantle her power the same way he'd dismantled cartels, methodical, precise, and merciless. Karen had no idea she wasn't dealing with a victim. She was dealing with a federal predator who was waiting for her to make the fatal mistake. Karen's campaign escalated like clockwork. Notices appeared weekly. First, the unauthorized garden structure, Emily's memorial bench. Then the improper use of the driveway, where John's government-issued vehicle sat parked. Finally, the outrageous claim that his American flag violated aesthetic harmony. Neighbors whispered about the absurdity, but Karen thrived on fear. She'd crushed enough families with late fees and foreclosure threats to know most people broke before fighting back. But John was different. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply watched. Inside his home, folders stacked neatly on his desk. Each notice photographed, each encounter recorded. He pulled statutes from Colorado's HOA Act, highlighting every violation of due process Karen had committed. But Karen was not content with paperwork. One evening, while John attended a veterans memorial event, his security cameras captured her trespassing. Measuring tape snapping in the air. Flashlight beam cutting across Emily's memorial roses. At one point, she leaned into the camera and smirked, mouthing the words, "I own you." That smirk became evidence. And then came her most reckless move, dialing 911. Karen claimed John was armed and dangerous, threatening neighbors with his government-issued firearm. Patrol cars swarmed the street, officers rushing toward his door. But instead of panicking, John Carter calmly opened his door, badge in one hand, firearm safely holstered, body cam recording every second. The officers froze. He wasn't a suspect. He was their superior. And Karen had just filed a false report against a federal marshal. A felony. Her obsession had crossed into criminal territory. And John had been waiting for this moment. Word of the incident spread through Pine Ridge estates like wildfire. Neighbors who'd lived in fear of Karen began whispering openly. Some slipped John manila envelopes of their own, copies of fraudulent fines, threats, even photographs of Karen's late-night prowls. John compiled it all. False reporting, harassment, trespassing, fraud, a pattern of abuse stretching years, all tied to Karen's desperate hunger for power. But Karen wasn't done. Furious that her 911 stunt had backfired, she tried to smear John online. Posts on neighborhood forums accused him of abusing his badge, of intimidating innocent families. Yet every lie unraveled under the weight of real evidence. Her own fingerprints on forged documents, her voice on recordings, her smirk captured in high definition. And then came the turning point. During an HOA meeting, Karen erupted, screaming that John's memorial bench was a public safety hazard. But instead of backing down, John quietly slid a folder across the table. Inside, affidavits, surveillance footage, and a notarized complaint to the state attorney general's office. The room fell silent. Karen's face drained of color, because for the first time, she realized she wasn't holding the gavel anymore. The knock came early one morning. But this time, it wasn't Karen with another violation notice. It was law enforcement, U.S. Marshals, state investigators, and county deputies. Karen's carefully built facade crumbled in seconds. She stumbled out of her McMansion in slippers, screaming about conspiracies and vendettas, as federal agents slapped cuffs on her wrists. Her charges read like a catalog of downfall: false reporting to law enforcement, harassment, fraud, trespassing, and misuse of HOA funds uncovered during John's investigation. The same petty citations she'd weaponized against neighbors had become bricks in the wall of her prosecution. Neighbors lined the sidewalks, some in tears, others cheering. For the first time in years, Pine Ridge felt free. And at the center stood John Carter. Calm, silent, watching as Karen Whitfield, the woman who thought she owned the neighborhood, was driven away in the back of a patrol car. She had tried to destroy him with lies. Instead, she had built her own prison with arrogance. Karen's downfall was more than one man's victory. It was a community's liberation. In the weeks that followed, Pine Ridge residents voted her entire board out. Transparency rules replaced secrecy. Neighbors once silenced by fear shared their stories openly, building a network of support that stretched beyond the subdivision. John Carter never sought revenge. He sought justice, and justice had prevailed, not through anger, but through patience, evidence, and the law. The memorial bench remained exactly where Emily had loved to sit, now surrounded by fresh flowers neighbors planted in quiet tribute. For Pine Ridge, the message was clear: tyrants thrive in silence, but they crumble when communities stand together. And for Karen Whitfield, the woman who thought she could weaponize rules against the very people they were meant to protect, her reign ended in a cell, replaced by a legacy of fear, shame, and federal records. What would you do if your enemy handed you the evidence to destroy them? Have you ever fought back against an HOA tyrant? Share your story in the comments. It might just inspire someone else to stand up. And if you want more stories of justice served, subscribe now, because the next battle proves that even the smallest community can rise against corruption.